Chapter 13, Nationalism, Imperialism, and the Great War. Part 3, Armistice and Peace. The end of the war. Armistice. Ultimately, Wilson's offer of a fair and just peace was heard in Germany, now wavering in its loyalty to the Kaiser. Inquiries were sent to Wilson at the beginning of October 1918 about the possibility of a ceasefire. Then, when around the same time the Allied armies broke through Germany's heavily defended line of defenses, the so-called Hindenburg Line, the Germans realized that the war was finally truly over for them. But Wilson's requirement that the Kaiser abdicate was a major sticking point. Then, inspired by the Russian Revolution of the previous year, in late October, first sailors, then soldiers, then workers, joined a growing revolt and simply took command and set up Soviet-style councils in the various cities across Germany. Political chaos resulted, especially when the two wings of the large Social Democratic Party, that is, the Marxist Party, fell into fighting over whether or not to accept Wilson's peace offering, and then moved quickly to set up a Soviet-style communist government in Germany, or instead redesign Germany as a parliamentary republic. Ultimately, most of the soldiers and workers threw their support to the pro-parliament Social Democrats, led by Friedrich Ebert, who took control of Germany's government on the 9th of November after Prince Max announced the end of the German monarchy. Realizing that he had lost all political support, the next day Wilhelm went into exile in the neutral Netherlands. Meanwhile, Germans had their discussions with Wilson about an armistice, which they were willing now to accept on the basis of his 14 points. Wilson agreed. However, America's allies, England and France, had no intentions whatsoever of honoring Wilson's peace terms, as they sought unconditional surrender of Germany and nothing less. They had gone along with Wilson's 14 points only because they needed American aid and because they had recognized the propaganda value these had in undermining the Kaiser's political authority in Germany. Unaware of what was actually going on politically within the camp of its adversaries, the Germans complied with Wilson's demands and declared the creation of a German republic and announced their willingness to accept an armistice based on Wilson's 14 points. Thus, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of the year, that is November the 11th, 1918, the guns finally fell silent in Europe for the first time in over 4 years. The war was over. Meanwhile, tragedy continues in a new form. The 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. Whereas the war had caused approximately 16 million deaths, a flu which struck broad sections of the world, including America, in 1918 within mere months killed 3 times as many people. The flu hit in the spring of 1918 but involved few deaths. But when the disease reappeared in the fall of 1918, it was devastating. Age, health, city or country living made no difference in its attacks. 500,000 Americans died from this flu, and those it did not kill, it produced permanent effects for approximately a quarter of the U.S. population. In a few short months, it lowered life expectancy in the United States by 12 years. And thus it was that as 1919 came into view, it was with much hope that the Western world greeted the first year since the end of the war and the devastating Spanish flu. Certainly much, much better days lay ahead. The so-called Peace of Versailles. Quote, "To the victor belongs the spoils," unquote. Tragically, reality would soon deliver a huge disappointing blow to such hopes, and especially to the expectations of a triumphant Wilson. When all the warring parties sat down together to work out the specific terms of the peace that had looked so promising as 1918 came to a close. Being the idealistic humanist that he was, Wilson failed to connect American power with American diplomacy, and thus the English and the French took the opportunity to pounce upon the exhausted Germans to wreak an expensive revenge despite Wilson's protests. Probably no English or French politician who failed to bring home to his people some major exaction of retribution against the Germans would have had a political future. But Wilson had power to use to move things more in the direction he wanted to see them go. But caught up in his utopian world, he failed to see the diplomatic opportunities he actually possessed in order to direct negotiations along lines he had desired. Wilson was deeply troubled at the bullying behavior at the peace table of his democratic allies, England and France, quite in violation of his much-cherished notion that democracies will automatically behave only in the most enlightened way. His fellow democracies instead were determined to force crushing peace terms on Germany and to confiscate the Arab lands of the Ottoman Turks, very much in violation of the equitable peace terms which Wilson had announced to lure everyone to the peace table in the first place. Thus, Wilson found himself shocked as he discovered that the English and French were not interested at all in assisting him in spreading his idea of the rights of national self-determination of peoples everywhere. They were not about to do this because that would have meant giving up their own multi-ethnic or multinational empires. And to Wilson's great distress, things were not doing well in Russia because not blissful democratic peace, but instead a violent civil war had accompanied Russia's move to democracy. And this civil war had Russia's Democrats lined up on the same side with the old Russian autocrats, that is, the whites, in a ferocious battle against the Marxist-Leninist communist insurrection, that is, the Reds. Wilson's proposed League of Nations. On the other hand, Wilson was able to get his allies at least to accept his 14th and final point of the 14 points, the idea of a world assembly, the League of Nations, where he hoped cooler heads could eventually come together once the fever of war had subsided and then right the wrongs of the abominable peace treaties foisted by the democracies on their defeated enemies. But his plan was greatly foiled by his own United States Senate's refusal to go along with his grand international project, and more importantly, by his own personal intransigence. The extensive commitment required of membership in the League alarmed American senators when Wilson's League of Nations idea was put before them as a treaty requiring senatorial ratification. Senators demanded some compromises that permitted to still control American foreign policy. In particular, the constitutional rule that Congress must be the one, not an international organization, to take America to war. The Senate, whose approval was necessary for all treaties to be fully ratified, was willing to cooperate with this new international government, but with a few key reservations. Wilson's advisors begged Wilson to accept some compromises with Congress concerning these quite reasonable demands, but Wilson was a purist for whom compromise was an ugly and inadmissible concept. He would have the treaty bringing America into the membership in this new international organization only under his terms and no other. Thus the venture came to nothing in the United States when the Senate failed by only a few votes to ratify the treaty, even while most of the rest of the world went ahead with Wilson's project and joined the League of Nations. Irony of irony, America was the only nation of note not to join. The larger impact on the international status quo, the German sense of betrayal. Likewise, the betrayal of Wilson's promise of an equitable peace to which the Germans thought they were agreeing when they laid down their arms would become the source of German ideological opportunity for those, Hitler and the Nazis, who sought to exploit this sense of betrayal, Durchstoß, or stab in the back, to overthrow German democracy and institute a Neue Ordnung, or new order, in Germany. In short, the peace of 1919 merely set the scene for a return engagement 20 years later in the form of World War II. Czechoslovakia. In the peace treaties, the German and Austro-Hungarian empires had large slices of land taken away from them to be awarded to the newly reconstituted Poland and the newly invented Czechoslovakia. The latter, Czechoslovakia, was founded on an uncomfortable union between the westward-oriented Czechs or Bohemians and the eastward-oriented Slovaks, and contained a huge number of Germans along the Czech border with Germany, the region called Sudetenland. Poland was restored after having disappeared for a century out of the territorial loss of Russia, Germany, and Austria, with no tradition of democracy to guide it into the new era of Polish democracy. This reconstituted Poland also contained vast numbers of ethnic Germans, which would make for a very uncomfortable situation facing the new Polish government, leaving Poland as a vulnerable target should its neighbors recover strength enough to grab back their lost territory, which they would in 1939, starting another world war in Europe. Austria-Hungary was split into two separate nations, losing a lot of territory in the process, and like Germany, acquiring democratic governments in order to make them members in good standing in the new democratic world. Yugoslavia. The Serbs, who had been allies of the Big Four, were awarded the central or commanding position in the newly constituted nation of Yugoslavia, meaning South Slavia. Also, an uncomfortable union among Serbs, Croats, Slovenians, Bosnians, Albanians, and Macedonians. Romania. A large section of Hungary was awarded to another ally, Romania, recently independent nation, split off in 1877 from the Ottoman Turkish Empire. This too would make for a very uncomfortable Romanian union between ethnic Hungarians and ethnic Romanians. Bulgaria. An Ottoman province until it achieved full independence in 1908, had been an ally of Germany and Austria, and thus suffered accordingly, with the loss of territory along the strategic vital coast of the Aegean Sea, awarded to its newly formed or reformed democratic neighbors. The Turks. The autocracy to suffer undoubtedly the largest territorial and thus political loss was the Turkish Ottoman Empire. This empire had its vast but quite loose Middle East Muslim holdings carved up into a number of newly independent nations, leaving the ethnic Turks themselves only a small remnant of an independent state in the center of Asia Minor. The English and French took for themselves big slices of the Ottoman Empire, awarding themselves control over the newly formed Arab states under the so-called mandate system. The idea of the mandate system was that these Arab states were not really for self-rule, and thus, though independent, were carefully supervised by the holders of these mandates, Britain and France. Thus it was that Mesopotamia, that is Iraq, and Palestine were put under the dominion of the British, and Syria and Lebanon were placed under the French. The Arabs. These new states had some ancient historical claim to political existence, though hardly as true nations. Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Mesopotamia, after 1921, termed Iraq. Although mostly Arab in culture, these former provinces of the Ottoman Empire were made up of a mix of various contending Muslim sub-communities and even a mix of ancient Christian communities. They had lived side by side in some degree of peace under the enforcement of the Ottoman Turks, but with the Turkish authority removed, these new states were forced to try to find a spirit of national unity on their own, a virtually impossible task. Western-imposed democracy instead offered these many sub-communities the opportunity to revive ancient and bitter ethnic rivalries, which only a strong-handed monarchy, backed by British or French power, seemed to be able to bring forcefully to some semblance of national peace. Indeed, as democracies, These new states were pure fictions. German colonial lands in Africa and Asia. Germany suffered the loss of its African colonies. England and France held on to theirs for another 40 years. These too being turned over to the English, the French, and their Belgian and South African allies, also as mandates. German colonies in the Pacific were awarded to England, Australia, New Zealand, and even Japan as mandates. Italy. For its pitiful contribution to the winning of the Great War for democracy, Italy was awarded German-speaking Austrian lands on the southern side of the Alps, that is, South Tyrol. Russia, meanwhile, was plunged into a long and bloody civil war, 1918 to 1923, between Lenin's communist Reds and the coalition of Kerensky and the Tsarist Whites. Ultimately, more soldiers and civilians died from the Civil War than had died during their participation in the Great War. In the end, it was Lenin's communists and the Red Army that won the day in Russia. But interestingly, once in power, Lenin backed away from some of his original ideas about moving directly to a communist economy and society. In 1921, with the new Russian or Soviet economy in shambles, due in great part to this horrible civil war tearing Russia apart, Lenin introduced his new economic policy, NEP, allowing small-scale farming and light industry to operate on a moneyed or capitalist basis, which indeed soon brought considerable stability back to the Russian economy. Footnote. But this was viewed as the Bolsheviks merely as a temporary arrangement to be replaced by a fully socialist or communist economy as soon as possible. And indeed, in 1928, the new Soviet leader Stalin ended the NEP and moved the entire Russian economy under the total control by the Soviet government in order to direct Russia towards the goal of full communism. Moral spiritual disillusionment among the victors. In general, the so-called victorious democracies, America, Britain, France, and Italy, were badly stung by the death and destruction that had ultimately produced no real progress in world civilization. Consequently, the democracies suffered a deep drop in moral nerve after the war. The aggressive instinct that marked the West's presence in the larger world before the war was largely lost, replaced among a number of the West's political leaders by a tired, timid spirit, a spirit which hoped that future conflicts would be avoided by a new attitude of mutual appeasement. American disillusionment. Likewise, America came quickly to the conclusion that it had been deceived in its taking up of arms to fight for the cause of democracy. The results of the peace were not at all what Wilson had promised that the sacrifices of war would produce. Americans quickly became cynical about Wilson's great crusade and determined never again to be smooth-talked into getting involved in a European war. Footnote. This failure of his dream to come true ultimately helped to break the spirit of the president himself, and he ended his last couple of years in office as a spiritual and physical invalid, which was never revealed at the time to the public at large.